Okay. So this is all about making events accessible, presented by Community Medical Solutions. And of course, accommodations, visual descriptions, captions, sensory safe, distraction free, no triggers, and large text. Disabled people have so much to add to the conversation, especially when it comes to politics, but are so often left out, even in intersectional spaces. The importance of accessibility. Accessibility is important because it allows all people, not just able-bodied people, to participate in activities. Can you mute yourself?
Yep.
Without accommodations and accessibility, disabled people are unwillingly segregated to spaces and events that are made by and for disabled people and are centered around accessibility and disabilities. Accessibility allows people to participate in all kinds of events without causing more symptoms or being relegated to specific events and spaces only. In the photo is of many protesters holding signs, and some are in a wheelchair. Hi. So, of course, voting accommodations are very important. Disabled people couldn't vote until 1989. That was when it was like made possible that voting booths were accessible. But even now, not every voting booth is accessible. So how it is, there is curbside voting due to COVID. Some states have mail-in voting. And then there are accessible voting booths, but not all voting booths are completely accessible. And the accommodations are different for different areas. How it should be. All booths are completely accessible, mail-in voting everywhere, and online voting for people who are housebound. And the photo is a black and white photo of many protesters in wheelchairs. And the center, there's a lady in a wheelchair that has a sign that says asking did not work. Online events. So this is how to make online events accessible. Have subtitles and or sign language interpreters. Have large text and audio description. No loud sounds or bright lights. Have trigger warnings for major triggers for PTSD. Record events in case people's symptoms prevented them from attending. Give people notes before so they can read what's going to happen for sensory processing disorder and developmental disabilities. Minimize background noise and other distractions for ADD and ADHD. No flashing lights for epilepsy. Give people a full transcript of the meeting before and after for deaf people and for sensory processing disorder. If an activity involves typing and somebody is unable to type due to a disability, let them speak instead. If somebody has tics due to Tourette syndrome, don't make a big deal out of it. Being disabled and the online community. As a disabled person, discrimination and ableism and inaccessibility make us less likely to go outside and more likely to stay inside and find a specific community online. Having a rare diagnosis or another marginalized identity also makes you have a decreased access to medical care, leading you to be bedbound and housebound more often, and thus you rely on the online community and technology more. And the photo is of a man in a wheelchair with a computer with social media speech bubbles above his head. The issue with relying on online spaces. As a disabled person, relying on online spaces made by able bodied people for able bodied people, we often encounter inaccessibility. All accommodations are not guaranteed. Normal accommodations offered audio subtitles, no flashing lights or flashing light warnings, trigger or content warning on major triggers, basic audio descriptions, recording of video offered sometimes. If you can't type, they let you speak. And like I said, it's very much a hit or miss with all of these accommodations. Access for all lets everybody be included. Lack of access means people being excluded because of their disability. And the photo is of a wheelchair user and a curb with no curb dip, making in-person events accessible. How it is. Stairs and steps in narrow corridors that are too narrow for a wheelchair. No sign language interpretation or subtitles. No space for wheelchair seating. No flashing light warning. No audio description. No sensory safe space, which is a quiet and dark space for people with sensory processing disorder to go when they feel overwhelmed. No bright light and loud sound reduction. No allergen minimization. How it should be. No stairs or steps or have an elevator. And wide enough corridors for a wheelchair. Sign language interpreter and subtitles. Wheelchair seating, no flashing lights at all. Audio description and large text. Sensory safe space and bright light and loud sound reduction. Allergen minimization. This whole section will be on marches and also the history of the disabled community and marches. So marches are not accessible to any disability for a multitude of reasons. No sitting spaces or rest breaks, no attention paid to curb cutouts, lots of loud sounds and allergens, no sign language interpretation, no guide for the blind, no video stream option for housebound people, no trigger minimization, lots of standing, a very long route, poor roads, not good for wheelchair users or people with balance and weakness issues. Making marches and rallies accessible. The photo here is of many people in wheelchairs at a protest and a large flag with stars in the shape of the classic wheelchair user icon. Pride marches. Recently, there's been a big push to make Pride more accessible, but it's definitely not perfect. Accommodations that exist. Rest areas. Seating area for wheelchair users. Sign language interpretation. Shorter routes. Accessible place for party. Elevator inside if 2 stories. Choose somewhere with good roads. Most Pride events still aren't accessible. For the length of parade routes, uneven grounds, summertime temperatures, crowds, and the lack of disabled seating areas, or not enough space, no interpreters, no space for wheelchairs, loud sounds and bright lights, no quiet space for people with anxiety or sensory processing disorder to go, when they're overwhelmed, no guides for the blind, and no space for people with white canes to walk, and no flashing light warning for epilepsy or no reduction of flashing lights. Why make marches accessible? Disabled people have a unique perspective that can contribute to a lot of political discourse. Lots of people would go to marches, but it's not accessible, so they have no choice but to stay at home. In 2021, inaccessibility shouldn't be a barrier to access for anybody to do any activity. Disabled people still lack rights and representation, but ironically lack the resources to protest. Do you have any questions?
No, we're good.
No, yeah. So the trigger for PTSD,
Sorry, what?
the triggers, warnings for PTSD? What's the example?
So, for example, for a women's march, if they're talking about cases of rape and you know how that's an issue, you would like warn people ahead of time that you're going to discuss this, or even maybe schedule it at the end so that people who have survived rape can just leave early so that they don't have to like listen to everybody talk about it.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure what that entailed. Makes sense.
Yeah, and then so for sensory processing disorder, like lights and sounds are very overwhelming. And so having a quiet, darker room where they can kind of unwind in the middle of an event would be very helpful. For example, it's like Comic-Con. Some Comic-Cons and other events similar have started having a quiet room where people with anxiety or sensory processing disorder and autism can go there and spend some quiet time like unwinding in between events. And that's made it possible for a lot more people with those conditions to go to those kinds of events where if they went, they could have like a meltdown or a breakdown or just feel super overwhelmed and feel really shitty afterwards. So that's what the sensory safe space is. And that's also why I try to minimize very loud sounds and bright lights in all of my events. So there have only been 3 disability rights marches in the USA. The photo here is of a woman in a wheelchair that has a shirt on that says, "The future is accessible." History of disability rights and pride marches. And I mean disability pride marches, not pride marches. So the first was in 1990. The last one was in 2002. They did not have full accommodations to all disabilities, but they were way more accessible than any other march. And in the bottom, there's a lot of photos of different people in wheelchairs and standing, and also little people holding up signs in protest. There are multiple disability rights marches planned in 2020 and 2021, but they were canceled due to COVID. So here there's a photo that has a woman in a wheelchair, a power chair, that says we can't move forward in society unless the disability community feels properly seen and heard. For the disability community to be seen, it must be accessible to all disabilities. People protested for months to get accessible buses. Here there's a photo of many people pushing their loved ones in wheelchairs while they hold signs. Disabled people had to protest to get the Americans with Disabilities Act. They literally crawled up the steps of the White House to demonstrate what inaccessibility does to a person. Why is our history and protest important? It's important to see how hard people had to fight to get the things we rely on daily. It's essential to know how others fought before us so we can build on that foundation that's already been laid. We have more respect for the disabled community and our tradition of protest. We understand the contributions of other disabled activists have made to improve our quality of life daily. Access for reduced mobility. So I'm going to go over how we can make marches more accessible for specific types of disabilities now. Choose a good street and put in temporary ramps and inaccessible places. Have a shorter march with rest breaks and plenty of chairs. People who can't come physically call in to speak. People who can't come make signs for able bodied people to carry. Have mobility scooters or golf carts for people who need them. Access for the blind and deaf, for blind people. Have space for people with white canes to walk and have people giving guided directions, also for people with white canes or service dogs. For the hard of hearing and deaf, sign language interpretation and audio subtitles on all videos. There's a photo of people in front of the White House in wheelchairs with a flag that has the wheelchair icon made out of stars. COVID protection. Masks required unless medically exempt. Take temperatures, social distance, and have hand sanitizer for free. Here, there's a photo of many people standing and sitting in front of a banner that says "Not dead yet." Many people have crutches or wheelchairs. Making a public event sensory friendly is being an ally to people with sensory processing disorder and autism. Have audio captions available because they have issues processing auditory information. Have earplugs available for free. No loud sounds or bright lights. Have a quiet area that's sensory safe that they can go to. Have notes that they can read before, during, and after, because that helps them like prepare and follow along with what's happening. And it also helps. So a lot of people with a developmental disability, especially autism, are very rules oriented and don't like their routine to be changed. So it also helps if you have like a schedule to give that to anybody with like autism and similar conditions so that they know exactly what's happening and when. So give them a schedule and don't change it so that they know like exactly what's happening and when and where. And then mental illness can also be a disability that stops people from going out in public, but people often don't think of that as something that needs accommodations. So have licensed counselors around. Sorry, this is for anxiety. Have licensed counselors around. Have free fidget toys. Have an anxiety-free room where they have weighted blankets, calm music, and low lights. For PTSD, minimize common triggers, respect service dogs, and have a PSA on trigger minimizing. So again, like depending on the context of it, like if it's a women's march, maybe have an area where people can talk about their trauma and then have a specific area where people don't talk about their trauma. So anybody who has PTSD knows that when they're in that area, they won't be, exposed to that because just hearing that when you have PTSD can bring it all back. So allergens. There are many people who have idiopathic anaphylaxis or MCAS, which is tied to Ehlers-Danlos, or even just common allergies. And this can also stop people from going out because they never know like when or where they're going to encounter the allergen, and they can't really control what other people do. So keep away from strong smells like perfume, scented deodorant, perfume, soaps, and detergents. No common allergens like peanuts, and no smoking. Protests. Oh, do you have any questions?
No, not a question, but a comment. I bet that made quite the impression when they protested at the White House and they literally crawled up the stairs to show what inaccessibility looks like.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of respect for those people.
Yeah.
And you can look up photos of it, and it's definitely impressive. Like, so many people just crawling up the steps because they didn't have any ramps. Shit, sorry. Protests are another thing that are not accessible at all. So protests and COVID, either masks aren't mandatory and people don't social distance, or masks are mandatory and you can't wear, and if you can't wear one for a medical reason, you can't go at all, and they're not understanding or accommodating. Why aren't protests accessible? Too much standing, no seating area, too much loud sounds and no quiet area for people with SPD and autism, lots of allergens, too crowded so it's hard to walk with a cane or crutches, maybe flashing lights with no warning. If you're sitting, you can't see anything, no sign language interpretation, and no audio description. Making protests accessible. Have chairs and a seating area, no flashing lights at all. Have a quiet area for sensory sensitive people. Limit yelling and shouting. Have free earplugs. Have a sign language interpreter. Have audio description. Have space for people with mobilities and white canes to walk. Inform guests on how to treat service dogs properly. Ban common allergens and choose inaccessible streets. And also make sure that everybody wears a mask and take temperatures. But if people can't wear a mask for a medical reason, don't force it on them or make them choose between, bad symptoms or don't go at all. And then this is my contact information. My next event is Living with EDS and HSD Resources. It's tomorrow from 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then this just says, remember our history and create a new future. And it's an accessible transportation protest with many people in wheelchairs holding APA signs. Questions or comments?
Are you going to send the link for the 3 to 5 tomorrow?
Yeah.